So I'm somewhat of a hobby junkie. About every 6 months to a year, I've got to find something new to obsess about. And it just so happened I was in Israel, touring the Holy Land, reading my Bible and walking the text and hanging out with the Jewish people. And their passion for the land was just undeniable. This whole heart and longing to build and to plant, to build and to plant. I started looking around and they're growing everything everywhere. And I looked at the climate there and the climate back home and I thought, it's actually very similar. I should quit going to the local farmer's market, dropping all that coin on groceries. I ought to grow my own food. So sure enough, I came home, ripped out all the grass in my backyard, and I started planting stuff. We planted grapes and cherries and pomegranates and figs and berries and about 200 square feet of raised vegetable beds. If you can grow it, we're growing it. The problem is I realized pretty soon after all the work and effort I'm putting into growing things, there's also something else that I'm growing that's not of worth, that's not of value, that I didn't plant and I didn't ask for and is there uninvited. And that's weeds. It's like every time you turn around, you spend 2 or 3 days outside of the garden and boom, they're there again. And if you leave them unchecked, those things go to seed and they'll take over everything. And I realized that those weeds in my garden are very reminiscent of a weed that grows in our spiritual life as well. See, when you look at our spiritual life, if left unchecked, there is a weed that will grow, and if we leave it to go to seed and spread, it'll take over everything, and that weed is pride. Pride is a fascinating thing. See, pride is something that we find in the depths of our hearts that fights against the concept of a sovereign God. Pride is something that says to God, in fact, I appreciate your input in my life. I appreciate that you're omnipresent, that you're almighty, but I think that I've got a better idea of how to do life than you do. Those are all weeds of pride. We come about it naturally. If you go all the way back to the early parts of the book of Genesis in chapter 3, Adam and Eve, who are living in a perfect relationship with God, are given the opportunity to choose to submit to God or buy into the lie. Buy into the lie that they're the ones that really matter, that they don't need to submit to anyone. And in fact, by disobeying God, they can be like God. And so sin comes into the world in Genesis chapter 3, and here we are, generation after generation after generation later, plunged into sin, brought forth in sin, and conceived in iniquity with the same tendency of pride, the same weeds of pride growing in our life. Now, Jesus is the opposite of that. When you look at the scriptures, Jesus models humility at every turn. In fact, the Apostle Paul said about Jesus that he did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, a thing to be hung on to or clung to. He wasn't striving for power or position. He wasn't striving for notoriety or a place of honor. In fact, quite the opposite. Jesus humbled himself. He clothed himself in humanity. He emptied himself and became a servant among us. Scripture says that he didn't come to be served, but to serve, and was a tremendous example of what humility looks like in our world. In fact, when you look at why Jesus came, he didn't merely come for the redemptive work on the cross, as powerful and significant as that is, but to give us an example of what humble submission looked like. When you trace the life of Jesus, humility literally saturated who he was. His life was driven by humility, and he never allowed the weed of pride to grow in his life. Multiple times we see throughout the gospel Jesus reflecting incredible submission to the Father in all things. He says he didn't come to do his own will, but only that which the Father had sent him and called him to do. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying tear-stained prayers of incredible desperation. He says, Lord, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. He says, not my will, but yours be done. Even in that moment, he demonstrates incredible submission to the Father. The thing that's so dangerous, by the way, about pride in our life is that the scripture is very clear that God is not passive when it comes to pride. God does not look at pride and allow us to toy with it, but rather God, it says, is opposed to the proud, which means that God takes a stance against pride. Pride in our life is the antithesis of what it means to follow God. And when that weed is present in our life, he goes for it and goes after it viciously to uproot it from our life. You see that, by the way, in the example of the life of Peter. The Apostle Peter was a fascinating character, personality plus. But he was the one who really wanted to be the chief apostle. He was the one who really longed for the place of prestige and honor. He was the one who wishes he was the one whom Jesus loved. And all throughout his life, as he interacted with Jesus, he was the one answering the questions, striving for the place of honor, and yet it's Jesus who's going to end up putting him in his place. Because Peter at the Last Supper is the one who says with the disciples all present, awkward as it was, I'm sure, for him to say, he says, Lord, even though all of these will deny you, I never will. And it's in that moment Jesus says, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me now 3 times. And sure enough, as you know the story of the life of Peter, that's exactly what occurs. And in that moment of betrayal of Christ, boy, his pride is put in check. Humility begins to grow. And God took him behind the proverbial woodshed to break him of that very thing that would make him sort of separate from God, which was pride. And it's Peter later on in his life who's going to write 1st and 2nd Peter about humility and about suffering. And he's going to say in that passage, he says, humble yourself therefore under the mighty hand of God, and he will exalt you at the proper time. Meanwhile, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Peter learned a valuable lesson in those moments of breaking. And that is that true spiritual formation, a true spiritual life that is dynamic and vibrant, begins with a humble submission to God in everything. So how do you know if you have the weeds of pride in your life? How can you tell? Well, there's a couple telltale signs to look for them. One is if you find yourself comparing yourself to others. That's a weed of pride in your life. If you find yourself putting others down that you might feel more important, that's pride. If when confronted on an issue, if you're immediately defensive, that's also pride. These are all indicators of something deep-rooted down inside, something that we don't have to cultivate. It's a desire for us that our name would be great, that we would be a big deal, that people would see us and look up to us. But the reality is, from a scriptural perspective, we're called to decrease, that he might increase. The very beginning of our Bible begins with, in the beginning, God. It doesn't begin with, in the beginning, you. God is the focal point. God is the one who is renowned. God is the one whose glory should be reflected, not us. And yet, if we're honest, we live in a culture that glorifies self-exaltation. It glorifies the closet narcissist in each of us. Take social media, for example. We post all of these pictures and drop all of these witty and clever sayings and whatever social media you choose to use. And most of them are designed, by the way, these posts, to make us look good, to show you something I'm doing that you wish you were, to drop some witty saying or witty phrase that makes you wish you were as clever as I am. All of these things designed to make us seem like we've got something going that we may not. Something that makes us look better than others. Something that makes a name for ourselves. That somehow we can be a big deal. And yet the reality is that God is the one who we ought to be exalting. God is the one that we ought to be lifting up. When it comes to the spiritual life begins and is sustained by the core of us being humbly submitted to God in all things. And until we were willing to submit to God, until we are willing to continue in submission to him, spiritual formation and spiritual growth cannot occur.